When my daughter-in-law opened my closet and began tossing my things into the yard, she said, plain as day, "It's trash." For a heartbeat, I felt small, a woman reduced to the edges of her own life by the sweep of a sleeve. I stood in the doorway, listening to the sound of old paper and fabric hitting the grass, a humiliating rain of memory. Then, slowly, I remembered who I was. My house has been in my family for nearly 40 years. My husband planted the first box of herbs with his bare hands. He taught our son to ride a bicycle on the cracked driveway. He taught me how to repair a fence post when the wind took it. The walls are generous with stories. There's a cedar chest in the hallway that smells faintly of lavender and cedar. A quilt folded at the foot of the spare bed that has been mended so many times its stitches are a map. And on the kitchen table, there is a stack of recipes written on index cards, ink faded by years of being read. For years, the house was the living archive of our family's small survivals. Chipped teacups collected in an open cabinet, letters tied with red ribbon, a tin where the school photos were kept. When my son and his wife needed a place after the storms damaged their apartment, I opened the front door and said yes. That's the thing about houses. You make room because they are built to contain more than furniture. They hold the possibility of safety. My son is gentle by nature, the kind of man who remembers birthdays without notes. His wife, let's call her Claire, was at first polite in a way that suggested she was weighing her new life carefully. At first, the changes were small and easy to explain away. A favorite mug would appear in a different cupboard, hidden so its chips were less visible. A casserole dish used at every holiday seemed to vanish and then reappear, wiped and put higher in the cabinet. Once I found a stack of envelopes, invitations, and cards tied with ribbon in the hallway. "I'm making room," Claire said, brisk and apologetic at once. "We don't need to keep paper like that." When I told her they were memory cards, my aunt's last birthday invitation, a note where my husband had scribbled a recipe for Sunday gravy, she shrugged as if memories were something we should shelve like outgrown clothes. There were other omissions that felt like small cuts. The apron my mother used to wear was folded neatly and tucked away, but then found in a plastic bag by the back gate. The casserole dish I used every Thanksgiving appeared one morning in the trash bin. The chipped teacup that lived in the sink drawer was tucked out of sight so only those who knew would notice it. Each time I mentioned these things, Claire used the same single-minded line. "Our home must feel fresh. We have to let go of clutter." She said the word clutter like a verdict, as if the past were a mess to be tidied away. I tried to speak with Claire in a reasonable voice once at the kitchen table with the late light warming the wood. "I know you're trying to make the place yours," I said, "but some things are family. They matter to me." She listened, but her eyes were already moving ahead as if she was measuring where the next box would go. "This house is too cluttered," she said. "We need fresh." I nodded because I wanted to be reasonable. Inside, a small, stubborn place in me said, "Be careful." I didn't understand then how careful I needed to be. The afternoon everything changed was bright and ordinary. The neighbor's dog barked at nothing, and Mr. Patel pushed his mower down his driveway. I had been in the back room arranging a pile of recipes when I heard the sound like someone taking a blanket and shaking it. I walked to the doorway and saw Claire at the top of the stairs, hauling boxes from my closet and flinging them over the railing. Quilts and boxes, tins and odds and ends came down in a cascade. The cedar chest sat open, its contents spilling like a life being unpacked on purpose. Words fell out of her mouth like something she had rehearsed. "We don't need this, it's trash." It was not simply an assessment, it was a decree. I remember the coolness that moved through me as if someone had taken the air from the room. I stood in the doorway and let the sound of broken glass and cardboard hitting the lawn stitch its way into my bones. A neighbor came out onto his porch and peered over the fence. Mrs. Alvarez from next door hovered with a dish towel in her hand. My son pulled up in the driveway in the middle of his lunch break and saw the yard strewn with my life. His face folded into confusion and guilt, a son confronted with the sense that he had given space to erasure without thinking about the cost. "Mom, he started, voice small. Around us, other neighbors began to gather like a human wall, their curiosity threaded with concern. I did something I'd never thought I would. I wrote names on a piece of paper. It felt simple, ridiculous even, and yet it steadied me. I sat on the steps in the late afternoon sun, and as neighbors came closer, I read the names aloud. "This is my mother's cedar chest," I said. "These are letters tied with ribbon. These recipes are how we fed our family during lean years." I told each thing's history, the pot that had belonged to my grandmother, the quilt stitched by hands that had seen more winters than mine, the apron that had absorbed the scent of decades of dinner conversations. Each object had a lineage. Each had sat at our table and known the way we patched up life. Claire shifted and looked suddenly small in the center of the garden, the person who had tried to throw stories away. My son stood between us, stunned. He began to collect the items that could be saved, wrapping the broken bits in newspaper. I asked him to help me gather the things that mattered. I did not demand revenge. I asked for respect. Setting boundaries and repair, resolution, action and consequence. "We will speak before anything is removed from this house," I said quietly, more like a setting of terms than a prayer. "If something belongs to someone, ask," my son promised. Claire hesitated, then came forward with a slow, uncertain step and began to help. Her apology was nearly inaudible at first. "I'm sorry," and yet it was there. She fumbled with a broken teacup as if surprised that it could be held tenderly. It was not an instant repair. Apologies can be stitches, but stitches need time to hold. That day taught me more about authority than any shouting ever could. Many imagine showing who's in charge as a dramatic, loud affair, a confrontation where someone loses their footing and the other stands triumphant. For me, it was quieter. It was standing steady while others expected me to crumble. It was naming the worth of things and insisting that a life lived should not be judged by a blind, tidy standard. It was allowing neighbors, ordinary people who had watched me carry groceries home for years and borrow sugar, to hear the stories I had kept tucked in drawers. When they murmured their own memories, when Mrs. Alvarez recalled a pie I had brought to her after her surgery, and Mr. Patel mentioned a quilt his mother had admired, the yard no longer felt like the scene of an erasure. It felt like a public remembering. "We will speak before anything is removed from this house," I said quietly, more like a setting of terms than a prayer. "If something belongs to someone, ask," my son promised. Claire hesitated, then came forward with a slow, uncertain step and began to help. Her apology was nearly inaudible at first. "I'm sorry," and yet it was there. She fumbled with a broken teacup as if surprised that it could be held tenderly. It was not an instant repair. Apologies can be stitches, but stitches need time to hold. That day taught me more about authority than any shouting ever could. Many imagine showing who's in charge as a dramatic, loud affair, a confrontation where someone loses their footing and the other stands triumphant. For me, it was quieter. It was standing steady while others expected me to crumble. It was naming the worth of things and insisting that a life lived should not be judged by a blind, tidy standard. It was allowing neighbors, ordinary people who had watched me carry groceries home for years and borrow sugar, to hear the stories I had kept tucked in drawers. When they murmured their own memories, when Mrs. Alvarez recalled a pie I had brought to her after her surgery, and Mr. Patel mentioned a quilt his mother had admired, the yard no longer felt like the scene of an erasure. It felt like a public remembering. Over the weeks that followed, the cedar chest returned to the hallway with new scratches and a new story to tell. Claire and I had awkward mornings. She would make a pot of coffee and leave it on the counter with a note that said, "I'll wash the dishes." I would write back small kindnesses that were also small bridges. My son became more present. He learned again and again to be a mediator, not because someone had told him to, but because he understood that family life requires tending. Sometimes he would bring home flowers for no reason at all, a simple offering that sought to soften the edges we had all contracted. There were hard moments. Claire would still glower at an old photograph left on a shelf or suggest that we declutter yet again. We would talk. She would explain the stress of losing her own space in the storm, the sense of being overwhelmed by what she saw as too many things. I tried to hear her. This was not purely about me. She had lost a home and was trying to find control. I had not thought about how my insistence on keeping every scrap of memory might look to someone carrying fresh wounds. Still, we kept talking, and we kept failing and trying again. There were afternoons when silence settled like dust, and other afternoons when laughter bubbled up as if something light had been set down. If you ask how I showed who's in charge, it wasn't with sharp triumph or domination. It was quiet, standing steady, naming what mattered, inviting others into the story. I set boundaries and kept my dignity. I let the neighborhood see that I mattered and that the house was more than a collection of things. The real authority comes from being rooted, knowing your history, your worth, and refusing to let someone throw it away. A year later, the pottery on the mantel holds its own quiet authority. My cedar chest bears its new scars like a map. Claire stands in the doorway sometimes and watches me tend the herb box my husband planted, and once, when I passed her in the hallway, she reached out and shook my hand in the way of someone offering truce. "Thank you for showing me," she said. I smiled, and for a wild second I felt the house expand underneath us like a well-loved dress that had been let out at the seams to hold one more. If there is a small truth I have carried from that afternoon, it is this: authority does not come from making others small. It comes from keeping steady and naming what is real. It comes from inviting others to see the weight of what they are about to discard. People remembered how to be kind to me because I let them hear my stories, because I spoke without anger, because I placed names on the objects that meant something and allowed neighbors to recognize themselves in those names. So if you find yourself standing in the doorway of a life you built, if someone tells you what you cherished is nothing more than clutter, tie your ribbons, hold your recipes tight, and speak. You may be surprised to find neighbors who will come out with their own memories to defend yours. You may find a son who learns to stand between two kinds of love. And you may find, slowly, that the house that holds you will remember you back.